So great, welcome everyone. It's with great pleasure today that we have Stelios Mikalopoulos from Brown University with us. I will just say a few words because Stelios needs no introduction, but we're very pleased with Leopoldo to have him here today because Stelios had a direct impact on many participants on this network that we formed, and clearly an indirect impact in the way in which, as a researcher, we think about economic history and economic development. It's thanks to his contribution, actually, that we started to get used to words like geographic information system, ethnography in the investigation of economic development and economic history in the profession. So we are, without any further hesitation, I'm giving the floor to Stelios. Stelios, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Giorgio, Leopoldo. This is a great honor to have me for the next hour present my joint project with Melanie. So this has been around at least in my brain for at least a couple of years, and it has been evolving, and you will see today the latest iteration of it. So here we go. So basically, what is the noble goal? That every project has a noble goal and fails miserably in the end of the day getting at this goal, is to get a measure, a proxy of the beliefs and attitudes of our pre-industrial societies. So, if you were to be provocative, we would like to get the world value surveys of our great-great-grand ancestors. Well, not there yet, even with Tesla soaring in the stock market. One more thing that, as Giorgio said, we have been basically using a lot of things, a lot of surveys, and a lot of evidence that comes from ethnography and anthropological studies, and really we have learned a lot from these disciplines. Nevertheless, one usual basically caveat that comes with whenever we try to shed light on how history shapes and influences economic outcomes today, we're always saying, yes, but we're not really sure. We're missing a lot of things, a lot of traits, a lot of other characteristics of these societies in the past. So it's like having very little information, and with this little information, we try to connect dots, but we're missing a lot of the canvas. Ethnographic atlas has been used fruitfully by many of us in this room or in virtual room. So basically, if we were to be able to just like add an additional proxy to reduce measurement error in this vastly used resource would be great. We can recover groups that are not covered by the ethnographic atlas and reconstruct traits that are not coded by the ethnographic atlas at all. So, okay, now fine, these are all very noble goals. How can we even start thinking about these guys? Okay, so this takes us to the title of the paper. This takes us to folklore. The last couple of years, or maybe a bit more perhaps, like Nobel laureates in our profession have been making the point that narratives matter. Narratives matter in many different domains, in understanding recessions and booms, in understanding basically deeply felt beliefs, attitudes, so, and of course, like the media non-economists will tell you, hello, yeah, seriously, yes, we know this forever, but how can we actually quantify this, like make a systematic case that narratives matter, and how this has been kind of not in the forefront of our research. So now let me get to what we're doing, a little bit of what we're doing, but let me first define what is folklore. If you look at the definition of folklore, it is really the collection of fictional stories, myths, jokes, proverbs, songs, tales, codes, forms, and results of celebrations, folk dances, and initiation rites. So it's kind of everything that defines our social landscape, right? And how, like a common code, and how we laugh about the same things with others, what stories we share, and basically it's a description of culture. And mostly, or always, at least in the past, it has been passed informally from one individual to another, usually through verbal instruction or through demonstration. Now, the good thing for us is that folklore is actually also a discipline. It lives usually in the departments of anthropology. Folklorists live in the departments of anthropology, and but they also talk a lot to guys that do literature. Why? Because they look at text and they document, classify, and interpret folklore and folk life. So it's a hybrid. It straddles the humanities and the social sciences. The brief history, it's basically a couple of 100 years old as a field. Folklore, it's like the godfathers are the Grimm brothers. It's like the first guys that kind of systematically put together a bunch of German stories right around the beginning of the 19th century. Why then? You have to think about that 19th century is a period of like large changes. Urbanization happens. Many peasants live the lifestyle in the villages, and now cities are becoming hotspots. So there is like a romanticism movement that tries to make the point that, look, our archaic ways, our traditions are fading. Let's now write them down, including the stories that are being told, in order to make them survive these dramatic changes that we see socially. So, Grimm brothers are the first to get to write down, this bunch of German stories. And, at this point in time and for the next 150 years, thousands of like curious intellectuals, ethnographers, folklorists, they would do the same in various parts of the world. So at some point, early 20th century, they figured out that, look, we have so much information, how can we classify them? So there's like this rise of folklore as an academic field, in the sense that now they try to systematically make sense of this corpus of material that accumulates. So they come up with the notion of motifs. And now motifs become kind of the main analytical theme of a folklorist. This now is the case for about 70, 80 years. The 90s come, and until today, we enter the world of postmodernism in humanities, which means what postmodernism, if I were to summarize it in a second, is that you cannot really compare things. Each incident of a narrative, of a motif, of a narration, of a story is unique. Is unique to the place, unique to the individual in the time of the day that is being narrated, depending on what is the audience, and which means that basically you cannot compare anything. We're not going to be comparativists. We will be comparativists in this talk. So we will stay as motifs as our main analytical tool. So what we have? What we have basically is that at some point we stumbled at this kind of hero of ours. So every story has a hero, and our hero in this talk today is Yuri Bareskin. So Yuri Bareskin is the anthropologist and folklorist at the University of St. Petersburg and the curator of the Museum of Anthropology of St. Petersburg. And he has basically created a novel database of oral traditions around about 1,000 pre-industrial societies. And at some point, 2.5 years ago, Melanie and I emailed him and said, look, we have read so many things about your interesting work. Would you be willing to share? And, a few minutes later, we basically find ourselves with a matrix of basically around 1,000 societies and about 2,500 to 3,000 columns. Each column has a header and a title and a description, and then a 01, whether the specific motif, the specific episode, image in the oral tradition is present or absent from the oral tradition. So what we will do today, we're going to start making sense of this catalog and see how, I'm going to do two things. The first thing in the next 15 minutes to 20 minutes will be to tell you, does this database make any sense? Before asking higher order questions, how trust is portrayed in folklore, how, risk-taking and things like that, let's start with the basic question like, does the geography that the folklore in the oral tradition describe, is it consistent with the geography where the group lives? Does it describe a group that is indeed, according to the ethnographers, a pastoral group or a politically centralized group? So some basic verification exercises that the hope is that will increase our confidence in using this catalog for higher order and more difficult questions for which we have no easy way to validate. Okay, so then the last 20 minutes, I'm going to say, look, I would like to use folklore to extract values and beliefs of our ancestors. Our great grandfathers are not around to ask. we kind of believe that folklore is one of the vehicles of transmission of culture across generations. So we're going to do two things. We're going to do basically machine learning exercises and crowdsourcing techniques, and we will look at what type of motifs predict risk-taking, altruism, trust, and gender norms today. Okay, so this is where I'm going. So, these images are usually what I have, just to motivate, what do we mean by folklore, right? It's like the transmission. There's a transmission of some story, of some legend, of some jokes, and things like that. Okay, so what is a motif? What is a motif? It's very hard to define, right? It's not like in physics, what is an atom or what is a neutron. But for Bareskin himself, what is a motif is a recurrent image, idea, or symbol that develops or explains a tale, and it often takes a form of a triplet, right? It's like an actor, there is an item, and an incident. It is not always the case that every motif has exactly this shape, but that's kind of the typical motif. Now, again, a motif, it's important to keep in mind, is not a lesson. Is not what did we learn from this tale or from this joke. It is just an image. May have some moral implications, may not have. Bareskin himself does not try to explain what actually did we learn from this parable or did we learn from this tale. It is just an image. A woman does X, Y, Z. Now, for certain societies, this may seem like absurd and obscene. In other societies, this may seem natural. Bareskin does not pass judgment. It just tells you that, look, this image appears in this oral tradition or not. And this is important to keep in mind as we try to make sense of these images. Now, there are two existing classifications. If you talk to a folklorist, the typical one that will come to mind is the Atu Index that has been developed by Arne Thompson Ute the last 100 years. This is kind of the best catalog. What is the downside of this catalog is that it is Eurocentric. Basically, it is the best thing to do when you want to study folklore in Europe. It is very limited for the rest of the world. So that's why we're going to use Bareskin's data set, because it's really balanced across space. We have two broad categories. If you were to think of the 2,600 motifs in Bareskin's folklore, roughly half of them are motifs about the cosmology and the theology. So half of the motifs would try roughly to explain why we die, why disease exists, why the sun and the moon, what are they doing, how they interact. And others are non-cosmological. They would describe adventures, heroes, tricksters, competitions, and things like that. Okay, and we have this for about 900 pre-industrial societies. Now, let me give you some examples of motifs in Bareskin. So what Bareskin has provided us, or has basically generated over his lifetime, he's about 85 years old right now, and unfortunately, because of COVID, I did not have the chance to have him over at Brown because, of course, for obvious reasons. But we have been talking a lot via Skype, and he has been very nice in sharing his shedding light on my ignorance and helping me understand folklore a bit better. So here are some examples of motifs. So that's a typical one. Task giver is a king or a chief, and here is a description. There is a person who gives the difficult tasks to the hero, is a prominent figure in the hierarchy, could be a king, could be a queen, and so on and so forth. Another one, which is very common in Europe, is this titled Kind and Unkind Girl. A girl meets a powerful person, behaves herself in the right way, and is successful. Another behaves in the wrong way and is punished. We have 160 groups that have this kind of idea of girls following, rules and doing well, disobeying and basically being punished. Now, my favorite one is the last one. Is the Earth grows big. It's very common. 280 groups would have this kind of idea. So I have like a few friends. One of them is a theoretical physicist at Dartmouth, and he was working on the inflation time of the universe, so the very first milliseconds, nanoseconds. And apparently, in the folklore of about 300 societies, they have exactly this notion that the original Earth was small and later increased in size from an original amount of small amount of original substance. Like the Big Bang theory is already known. I told him to stop his research and do something else. Okay, so now where do all the motifs come from? So I'm just showing you three motifs. There are 2,600 of those. So at some point, we asked Yuri. Yuri said, can you give us the references? And then, a document comes with about, 2,000 pages, 1,500 pages. and about 7,000 references therein. So Yuri has draws, makes reference to about 4,200 books, about 2,000 articles. There are many articles out there and many journals out there that are the folklore journals. You may not have heard of those. So it's the American Journal of Folklore, it's like our American Economic Review, and so on and so forth. Most of them are in English, many of them in Spanish, some in German and French. Yuri speaks 12 languages, so he has access to quite a variety of resources. Well, yeah, the Median Society in Bareskin, and this took us a lot of time to get at this slide because we had to match basically each group to the source of these 4,000 or 6,000 references. So to get at this number was costly, but finally we can actually tell you something. A typical oral tradition in Bareskin has about 15 publications. He has consulted 15 publications written by, on average, 12 authors, published in about 3.5 languages. Two important bits. The median publication date is 1970, but the median public date of the first publication of a given group is 1904. So usually how you would like to think about the folklore of a given group is there is a big volume that appears sometime in early 20th century, and then there is a lot of debate, additions that happen in the subsequent years. So the early publication is really when we first get the big chunk of the tales and legends for a given group. So here is one oral tradition. Here is the Laos. I'm not going to go into the details of the Lao. I'm just like this slide just tells you that it is a diverse set. It is like in French, in German, like various initial anthropologists that have published on the Lao oral tradition. Here is one of the books that we found online. And, I'm just going to go through very quickly of how you go from a book that has basically a lot of tales and a lot of narratives into Bareskin reading them and eventually coming up with, so here is the tale that Bareskin basically refers to in his, in his catalog, and then that's the motif. So what's the motif is basically the golden axe, and the description is as follows. There's like a man loses an axe, he's very poor, a spirit or an official offers him a golden axe, but the man does not accept it. Then he offers him other axes of various, silver and bronze, and he says, no, they're not mine. Eventually, he's rewarded for his honesty. Now, why I chose this motif? Because when I read it, it reminded me of Aesop fables, and it's like one of those that you grew up as a Greek. It's one of those that literally stick with your imagination about the golden axe. Now, it turns out that it is not only the Greeks that had this this basically idea or tale. Here is the distribution of societies that had an episode like the golden axe. No, so what do you have? So what do we have? We have 2,600 maps of locations of presence and absence of specific motifs. Okay. There are many caveats. We can basically spend the next 35 minutes thinking about caveats of the Bareskin's catalog. One thing, when do motifs come about? This is like the holy grail of folklorists trying to figure out exactly when a story started and in which part of the world. It has been heavily criticized because this is a very difficult question. Recently, with the advances of putting basically computers in linguistics and joining teams of crazy computer scientists and folklorists and linguistics, we have started getting some idea of when some very famous stories might have originated, like the Beauty and the Beast. Looks that it has been invented in a given location about 2,500 years ago. Rumpelstiltskin, another common European story, seems to be much older, about 6,000 years ago. So why I'm making this point, we really don't have an exact idea of every motif when it appeared, but certainly these guys are significantly older than what we have in the ethnographic atlas in terms of characteristics of the societies. So they are not matching, they're not coming from the same period. But how far apart they are, we don't really have a good idea. We have a single set of motifs, so it's like a snapshot. We don't have like the first century folklore of the the typical society. Now we have our our database, Yuri's database, is like telling you about the presence and absence of a given motif. It doesn't tell you how common it is or how basically often it is narrated. So that's important to keep in mind. We're looking at the extensive margin in the oral tradition. Bareskin, like we are in the heart of comparative mythology. So what does this mean? It means basically that we're going to be looking at motifs that exist in at least 2 or more traditions. So if there are tales that are only society specific and nowhere else to be found, these tales are not actually studied by comparative folklorists because there's nothing to compare to them to something else. So, you know, motifs are basically, they are found in different locations. So I'm just pitting you here. The most widespread one is like kinsmen of a hero, wife or bride try to kill or test him or suggest him difficult tasks. This seems to be the most widespread motif globally. It's about 350 societies that have this one. And one of the least widespread or the least common one is like this one: during a fire, the oyster burns, so the oyster shells are black. So that's kind of etiological one. Okay, original sampling, lots of measurement error, like so much measurement error that I cannot really think of how many different sources. Now, one thing that we can do is to say, look, if we start comparing oral traditions, that is groups that are within the same continent or within the same country or sampled by, let's say, when the original is sampled during the same time period, the biases of the original anthropologists or the curious intellectuals that were writing down the stories are relatively similar, and hence we can make some within continent or within country variation. We cannot really do much more than that, but that's one thing that we can do. So again, it's a single individual. Is like not unlike Murdoch, that is like a single individual putting together a lot of evidence from a given field. Okay, so Median oral tradition has about 60 motifs. The Russians have the largest number of motifs. Top 10 groups in terms of motifs are Germans, Greeks, and a bunch of Northerners. Now, the number of motifs, how should you think about those? That's a great question. Our answer is that, they reflect both the intensity of initial sampling and how many books have been written and how many, scholars have read and written about these oral traditions, but also the imagination of a group, like how many stories do they say. We don't know which of the two is going on, so we'll be using throughout the share of motifs in an oral tradition that mentions a given keyword so that we're talking about the intensity of an image rather than normalizing by the number of images an oral tradition has. So here are the societies worldwide. I know it's a busy map, so let me zoom in one that is relevant for our audience. So as you quickly see here, when I saw this map, I said, Yuri, how come you have so thorough and rich coverage of indigenous societies in the Americas? Well, it was where he did his PhD. His PhD was about cataloging the oral traditions of the Americas, or indigenous societies in the Americas. That's why it's like super detailed. And again, these are all indigenous societies. It's not newcomers, not the Frenchmen and whatever, the Englishmen. So here's like a snapshot of groups in Africa, and how many motifs per group. You see here, it's not totally lopsided in the sense like there is like many motifs for indigenous groups in like Canada or in Colombia. Rich coverage for Europe. Coverage is relatively limited in terms of the number of motifs okay, if you don't mind, I will move it. Okay, so I'm not answering. This is what
yes, just ignore it, Stalia. Sorry, my bad.
Okay. So what are we doing? Okay, typical society, 60 motifs. Let's move to the analysis. So the first part is the validation part, right? So, okay, so for the first part, we're going to say, look, I want to verify that the geography of the group or the ethnographic record of the group is consistent with what I can find in folklore. So I will do some basic text analysis. So what does this mean? I'm going to be looking for keywords and related words across motifs. And then, so for example, if I know that a given society lives close to earthquake zones, I will basically be going through all images and episodes that mention the word earthquake and related words, and asking in the end of the day, do I observe societies closer to earthquake zones? Do they speak more often? Do they talk more often about earthquakes? And I will talk about other geographic characteristics. So now these related words is key, right? How do I define the related words of a given seed, let's say? No, that's not the way to go. You have to basically tie your hands somehow. So what we do, we're going to use ConceptNet 5. This is like a network, a semantic network created by the MIT Media Lab, that in the end of the day, it gives you, you punch in a word. So if you go online and you write ConceptNet, you're going to find yourself in a website, and you can punch in any word you like, and it will immediately give you the top 30, top 50 related words. So we're going to take them off the shelf, and we're going to be basically using them every time I'm using one seed. I'm going to immediately be getting the related words. And then with this in hand, I will be going through the motifs and asking, does this motif in its title description contain any of these keywords or not? If it does, I will tag it as relevant for this topic. If it does not, I will move on to the next motif. Okay, now we will also do some sentiment analysis, where we're going to be saying, look, I'm going to use individuals, persons, to actually read the motifs and classify them. And I'm going to get back to this towards the end of this talk. So first part, geography and oral tradition. Is the physical environment reflected in the oral tradition of a society? It would seem obvious that it should, but Bareskin, when I told him this, said, probably you know very little about folklore, but let me illuminate you. So he said, look, you're thinking of groups as kind of plants, that they were always there, they grew up there, and you only find them in this specific part of the world. But that's totally wrong. Groups are an outcome of migrations. The location of the groups today is an outcome of historical migrations in the past. And you should think of folklore as a depository of all the images and episodes that this group has been accumulating through its existence. And by the 19th century, when nationalism occurs and borders are drawn, they get to stay where they are. But you have to think of folklore as basically giving you much more information of the current habitat. This might well be true, but then I said, look, if I actually show them that there is no correlation with the current habitat, how can I convince people that that information in folklore makes some sense? He said, look, that's your problem, that's not my problem. So now the good thing is that one thing I am better at from Bareskin is that I know data. So then I could actually do some systematic analysis. So here's what I'm going to show you in the next minute or so. Share of topic-specific motifs related to given geographic attributes and the geographic characteristics of where we can find these groups today. What we have from Bareskin, we have also given coordinates. So for each group, we can draw a couple of 100 kilometers and calculate the average geographic trait. We're going to be always controlling for the number of publications per oral tradition to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. And when this group was first, the first publication came in. Okay, so here's about earthquakes. Not surprisingly, these are a bin scatter plot of exactly 958 societies. The further you are from high earthquake zones, the less likely you are to talk about the intensity of earthquake tagged motifs declines. Storm. Related words: lightning, thunder, storm. Thunderstorm, here's a motif. It usually explains how basically storms come about. And which groups talk more about storms and thunderstorms? Those that actually live in locations that basically in the night, on average, in the last 20 years at least, from 1980 to 2000, there is more strikes of lightning, flash lightning density at night. Who talks about frozen and cold things? Ice, freeze, frosty, frozen. Well, the further away you move, on the horizontal axis, you have the average temperature in the last 100 years. Groups that live in colder places, they talk more about frozen things. Again, these are comparisons within country, right? So it's not that we compare the Arctic to the tropics. It's go within Russia, go within Chile, go within your favorite country. Who talks about wheat, rice, and crops more generally? Those groups that live in places that have higher agricultural quality. So again, I check that, kind of the environment shapes the type of motifs that you are actually describing. Now, let's get to the next step. Let's actually bring together the oral traditions of the group and meet them with the ethnographic record. So, let's have Murdoch, salute Bareskin. So once we do that, we can actually start thinking about, a bunch of characteristics like, let me just move to what we're finding. Agricultural groups in agricultural groups, according to the ethnographers, are groups that are more likely to talk about, crops. Pastoral groups, according to Murdoch, are more likely to be groups that talk about animal husbandry, that is horses, cows, so on and so forth. Groups that are fishermen, according to Murdoch, they are more likely to basically talk about fish, according to Bareskin. And hunter-gatherers in Murdoch are really those guys that talk about hunting in Bareskin. So, it's like this cross-validation that makes me feel a bit more comfortable that, these guys, can be used in tandem. So how about political complexity? One way to think about political complexity is, to think about how often you talk about kings and, the related words like rurals, princes, and things like that. Groups in the ethnographic atlas that talk more they're more politically centralized, they're much more likely to have a larger share of king-related motifs. Now, this takes me to the first application. In the ethnographic atlas, about 10% of the entries, they actually have no information on basically the political complexity. So one basically can use the predicted values and impute a political complexity for this 10% of the missing observations. We can talk more about how you can cross-validate this part, but in the interest of time, let me move on. How about trade? Trade is a big one. Trade is a big one for economists, but we have not, so far we did not have a good way to think about trade because ethnographers did not, at least in the ethnographic atlas, did not actually systematically put this information together. Well, but we can do something like that using trade as a seed in ConceptNet. So basically you can look at, how many motifs do you have about, thank you, Giorgio, do you have in the intensity of motifs about trade? And then you have basically a bunch of, and here is the intensity of trade motifs, and you can cross-validate it with some other measures. I have 10 minutes, so let me do the following. Let me forget about how you can impute, fill in information about high guards in the ethnographic atlas. And let me move on to the relatively more juicy part of the paper, which is about getting values out of folklore. So first of all, to get at oral tradition at the country level, we aggregate the information from the group level to the country level using the, Wiles, Puterman's dataset on migration. So we can think about the oral tradition of the typical Colombian, of the typical Venezuelan, of the typical Greek. For the Greeks, it's very easy because of little population movement. So we've done two exercises. One is about machine learning, and the other is like having humans read the motifs. So what is the machine learning part? It's like a string catch exercise. It's a lasso exercise. So the way we think about it, we say, okay, now how do you inculcate values of risk taking to your population in your oral tradition? And then if you start thinking about this, the answer can be in infinite ways. Like different oral traditions may think differently about risk and may basically be thinking positively about X and negatively about Y, but having the same lesson at the end. So one way to say is like, okay, forget it. I don't have a prior. If I don't have a prior, I'm going to basically say, look, break the motifs, the oral tradition into frequencies of keywords. So let's take the first 10,000 words and then have 10,000 right-hand side variables. Each right-hand side variable tells me the frequency of, the top 10,000 words in English. And then do a lasso, do a string catch method and see whether it gets you some predictors that make sense. So this is like the most agnostic way, let's say, to get values out of folklore. There are problems with that, so that's why we go to humans at the end. But for now, let's just see what we get once we do this exercise. So once you use altruism, so I'm using now the Global Preferences Survey, there is one entry for 75 countries on altruism, and then I can say, look, I ran a regression of 75 observations on 10,000 predictors on the right-hand side. I'm trying to think which predictor pops up. Not me, the last routine. So what I'm getting for altruism, it gets the following. Oral traditions that have more images that contain the word abusive, disrespectful, inappropriate, maltreat, obscene, and things like that, they're systematically less likely to be altruistic than compared to other oral traditions to other countries. How about risk-taking? Well, this is the keywords that basically the Lasso picks. Oral traditions that talk more about competitive challenges, poking, are more likely actually to give you, to have respondents today answering that we are in favor of, we like more, we're more risk tolerant than otherwise. It also picks words that do not really make sense, like couple, expansive, derive, so that's the key thing to keep in mind with a prediction, is that you may get words that do not make sense. And here are some examples of motifs that really is about risk-taking or not. Now, let me talk about gender roles in the last 5 minutes. So you see, one way that you should not actually, that machine learning is not good at, is really thinking about, positive or negative. Really, giving you sentiment is very hard in terms of folklore. So what we have decided to do, and that's what we have been working on the last few weeks or months, is basically to ask humans to basically classify motifs. So here's the application of gender roles to uncover how a gender is depicted in society's oral tradition. Now, the problem is that when you start thinking about, what question to ask, you're getting stuck. Like, should I ask like whether women are portrayed in a good way, whether men are portrayed in a bad way? But what is good, what is bad is really very, subjective. So what we decided to do is basically to talk directly about stereotypes. So, so what did we ask? The literature on media studies and gender studies has identified basically the following set of categories as categories associated with men, like they're usually violent, dominant, strong, physically active, arrogant, sexual. For women, the predominant categories, on the other hand, is that they are like emotional, submissive, domestic, dependent, and so on and so forth. So this is what we did. We basically took our motifs and we asked MTurks, read the motif and tell us whether the female character in the motif is depicted as one of these categories. And similarly for a male character, if there is a male character in the motif. So here are the stats. So here is basically, if you aggregate it at the level of countries, so we have 168 countries, the biggest difference between the two is that actually males are systematically more likely to be less submissive. Females are more submissive in the way they are portrayed. Males are systematically more likely to be portrayed as dominant, whereas female is less likely to be dominant. And males are also systematically more likely to be outside of domestic affairs and more physically active compared to women. So that's like a global portrait of how basically male and female characters are portrayed across like 170 societies. Here's kind of the geography, if you wish, of male bias. And now you can do a bunch of exercises, right? You can ask the question, do countries with more gender bias against women, what do women do? Well, there are women actually, so those countries, those oral traditions that have males are more dominant, less submissive, less engaged in domestic affairs, and more physically active, women work less systematically. So you can take two countries, Lesotho and Swaziland, they're almost next to each other, small landlocked countries. In Swaziland, women have the lowest, basically, they have the very submissive role, polygyny is rampant and things like that. There in the oral tradition, always women are actually at home and they are submissive. Take Lesotho next door. Actually, they have the best status of women in Africa today. They're both equally poor as poor Southern Africa countries. But in Lesotho, both in the folklore and in the labor force participation, they actually work much more. So here's the scatter plot. Now you can take it to second generation immigrants saying, look within Europe, you have guys from Pakistan, you have guys from Ghana, you have guys from, Sweden. How does this origin, how does the folklore of their ancestors affect their parents, affect their, status of women? They're more likely to be housewives. Men are more likely to say that women should stay home and jobs should be allocated towards men. Now, the key thing of this whole exercise, now I'm out of time, is that you can take these values at the level, at the level of groups. So basically, so this is what you can do. Now you have a full blown image of 1,000 pre-industrial societies of how women are treated versus men. So then you can start asking about, places with groups with more plow, do they actually, how are women portrayed? Groups where basically where basically men are working only in agriculture and women are not, what's going on with the gender bias. And you get some very, consistent correlations that, again, like this kind of the economy of these groups and the subsistence type really seems to map into the folklore that they are having. So this takes us to the idea that actually, where did we start? We start from a premise that we would like to better understand what our ancestors were thinking. And now, because we have all these studies that start from the past, and the past informs the present, and then the mechanism is some kind of intergenerational transmission that we do not really can touch, right? We don't really, we talk about it, we believe it, but we cannot really talk about persistence or instability. And that's why I think that this is where we get to folklore as a way to start thinking about the transmission of culture systematically. So then you can start thinking about change. You can think about change and stability because now you have 2 points in time that you can, let's say, correlate things with. You can now think about, go to the ethnographic atlas and the SCCS and do this filling in exercise for basically all values. You can start thinking about particularistic motifs and universal motifs. You can think about religion and folklore. In the previous part of the paper, we had a bunch of research on conjectures among anthropologists and whether it's true in the folklore, like the culture of honor among pastoralists, leisure in hunter-gatherer societies, like the silence hypothesis. There are like many famous hypotheses. One can basically use folklore to say, look, do they make sense in the context if you are to actually look at them in the traditional context of folklore? You can think about within oral tradition, diversity of narratives, which we have not talked about, think about ambiguity, and so on and so forth. So I'm out of time. Thank you so much.
You're perfectly on time, Stelios. Thank you very much. Great job. So actually now we're gonna open the question and answer. The usual rule applies. So if you want to ask a question to Stelios, just raise your hand and I will actually allow you to speak directly with him. So the first online is actually Tommy Murphy. I don't know whether Tommy, so if you want to speak, actually we're gonna unmute you.
Can you listen to me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Hi, Stelios. Fantastic work you are doing here. I'm really fascinated by this. Now, the only thing I had in mind is I've been thinking a lot about the possible bias that you might have by the time these motifs were actually recorded. And I wanted to hear what you have to say about this. I mean, the Green Brothers recorded all these European stories in the early 19th century, all right? And they were Germans and they have a bias in the way they actually recorded this. I presume all the stories are being recorded and eventually this guy is then processing in the kind of data you have, were recorded at different periods of time by different kinds of people with different cultural biases, each person. Have you tried to figure out whether putting some sort of dummy of when these were recorded and by which kind of people were these recorded, whether you get any significance there to see, I mean, trying to convince me that this does not generate any sort of bias there?
Great question, Tommy, thank you. So yes, so bias is really...
Well, perhaps it's not the right word, okay? But I mean, that is just I mean, twist the way in which you perceive this. I don't know what you get this.
There are differences over time in basically the technology used, the questions asked. You can think about the sampling, whether they were sampling women to tell the stories or men to tell the stories, whether these guys were speaking the local language or they were not speaking the local language. So what we can do, we do two things. First of all, we say, look, all these biases are there. We don't, to systematically get to a number, it is kind of, it's hard at least now. So we do two things. First of all, we can say, look, we can, first of all, add, when was the earliest publication for this specific society, to the extent that, books that appeared in 1890, the bias of the publishing houses was in favor of, stories that were saying X. so we can actually control for this. We can also kind of control, look within countries. So to the extent in Namibia, it was a German colony mostly, and all the books we have, the earliest books across societies were from German, basically colonizers or ethnographers, folklorists. Then the comparison is basically within Namibia with the same colonial history, with the same equally biased German samplers, we get this variation. So that we do a few things here and there that make me think that the bias cannot overturn what we find. So, for example, if I were to tell you, and we highlight it very nice in the paper, very nice. At least we try to make it very salient in the paper that if we were not to find these contemporary correlations for gender roles, so if we were to say that, look, folklore, in a given society has very high intensity of, male biased motifs, that males are the best and females are whatever, submissive, and this was not mapping into any consequential outcomes today, then I would start feeling a bit like, okay, so you have a biased guy that was looking for biased, female biased motifs, put them down. This has nothing to do with the society that he was sampling. There is no correlation between the two. So in some sense, I can also do some ex post rationalization that whatever bias I'm getting is not really overturning the extent of the signal that comes from this catalog. But more we do absolutely much more on that.
Okay.
Great, thank you, Stelios and Tommy. Now, are there other questions on the chat? Just raise your hand. Okay, so I see that Leopoldo has a question. So please, Leopoldo, go on.
Yeah, feel free to let other participants before me if that's the case. But
yeah, we don't have a question yet. So
okay,
please.
Good. So I get to ask. That's great. I wanted to. So you touched on this towards the end, Stelios, and thank you for such interesting talk. Is always very interesting to see topics that are so original in the sense that we probably have not thought about them enough in our discipline. And you were touching this at the end, which is one thing that came up when I was that came into my mind when you were presenting, is basically which of these things persist, in the sense that much of what perhaps it's being recorded at one point in time, and in that sense this might relate to the bias questions that Tommy asked before. Maybe it doesn't reflect which stories ever existed, but which stories actually persisted and people continued consuming them, and therefore by the 19th century, when these things were recorded, we know about them. But now it seems that it could be super interesting, and maybe this is in your to-do list, to look at the persistence since then till now. That is, we know that there were these ancient stories. Which of them still resonate in the literatures of these societies now? I think that could be really interesting, and I don't know if you have thought about it, if you have any insights, or if people have looked at this. I would be very interested to know.
There are thanks, Leopoldo. That's a great suggestion. So one of the things that we have seen in child psychology and child development, there is a lot of work about narratives, because again, for these guys, is narratives exactly what you can impart. You cannot get them to read, you cannot get them to do anything. If you want to impart messages, it must be a narrative that you try to get the message through. So there is lots of work about the importance of narratives for child development and child psychology. One thing that I really want to do is basically to say, look, go to the US today. We have this fantastic work now about, at the county level, the mix of immigrants, the mix of legacies of like Swedes versus English and Italians. So you have a composite, let's say, of a typical guy in northern Minnesota. And now you can actually see what they are reading in terms of children's books. So you can go to Amazon and you can see, children's book consumed in this part of the county. They are these titles that are common. Whereas in New Jersey, in this Italian, origin county, these titles are whatever, consumed. My hypothesis that, I have not seen tested, but I would like to do this is like to say, look, we know where these guys come from. We have a signal now in the oral tradition that they come from. Do they consume images and episodes that are very similar to the contemporary books that they're reading? And the conjecture is that basically persistence of Italian identity and persistence of Italian or Swedish way of thinking and Swedish way of, behaving can be partially traced to whether basically the children's book consumed in whatever southern Kentucky today is correlated with the origin, the place of origin of where these guys came from. So it's kind of the stability, as you say, or not, of consuming stories at an impressionable age, and this is the children's book world. So that's, I have not made any inroads to tell you whether this makes sense or not. But it's something that I have been thinking seriously, that this would nail it, would at least shed some light directly on this transmission mechanism, and that this is what we carry with us, right? Because this literature of second generation immigrants, and it's like, what you carry? You don't carry the geography, right? You carry your food, but is the food causing you to behave in the way you behave? We don't, probably not. We don't have these studies. But you carry your narratives, and narratives is really something that we've been missing. So in some sense, we've been doing all this literature of subsistence of persistence or not, in a world where everybody was mute, and we could try to infer things from basically actions. But now there is a chance with folklore to unmute them. So let our ancestors speak. And so hopefully with this type of applications that we have in this paper, it's just the beginning, right? It's just telling you that, look, here is 3 different ways to unlock the mastery of folklore. Yeah, so basically it's one of the first times that my conclusion is longer than the introduction, because I have much more to say about where we would like to go than where we currently are. Yeah, thank you. I see some Q&A.
Okay, so let me see.
How much variation in motif is there within countries and across countries? Very substantial variation in the sense we have about 1,000 groups, and a typical country has about 8-9 groups. So the variation is richer in Africa and Asia, not so much in Europe. Europe it's a bit more homogeneous, let's say, in terms of within country variation, mostly because so for Italy, for example, if Georgia would like to know, we have basically 3 groups: the northern part, which is like the central Italy, northern Italy, and then we have basically Sicily and Corsica. Now, where does this take me? It takes me to the observation that if you would like to do a region-specific exercise, or an Italian-specific or Greek-specific exercise, there are actually catalogs that are written specifically for Italy, specifically for this part of the world. So I hope that this machinery that we're building can actually be used not only for Bareskin's catalog, but can be basically implanted into the region-specific catalogs that are superior, of course, to any global catalog that we're working with. What do you think of the potentiality of Homo narrans concept as a good empirical substitute of Homo economicus, for example, by using narrative policy framework? Ooh. Yeah. This is Nelson Ferreira that is asking this question. It sounds too big to fail. No, narratives, you see, when we talk to our parents, we all get narratives. And our parents, when they were talking to their parents, they were getting narratives. So somehow it is it is this idea of narratives mattering. It permeates our society. It permeates the way we think. When we do economics, when I'm trying to convince you of a conceptual framework, or Leopoldo tries to do that, or Giorgio, they basically engage with a narrative. And then, either you buy the narrative or you don't buy, but in the end of the day, it's not the math that convinces you about the plausibility of the argument, is the narrative itself. So, which actually would take me to the next question, right? Our societies, if you were to look at folklore, our societies are allowing for ambiguity, or our societies clearly 0-1 world, that either you always kill when offended or not. So our society is thinking about best responses in terms of mixed equilibria, or actually they are clear-cut guidelines. And if there are, which are these? Which domains admit only clear-cut guidelines, and which domains are more fuzzy, in the sense they are more diversity of actions that can be allowed? You see, for now, we have been trying to just say, look, the mean response maps to the mean response. The mean response in folklore, how we deduce it, maps to the mean response across surveys today. But probably there's much more interesting thing in like the diversity of these methods, in the ambiguity of these methods. We're not there yet. Too low correlation between stories and behavior. I don't know that. It's a bit unclear. What does this mean exactly? Too low correlation between stories and behavior. There are theoretical papers, basically by, for example, Benabou and Tirol, that yes, try to make sense that basically you can always post-rationalize your behavior with a given narrative. So then this gives rise to the multiplicity that narratives are ex post rationalization. You only invoke them once you have exposed to rationalize your behavior. So here we think that, you know, we're getting to something more primitive, to an equilibrium, right? Then equilibrium a society has converged to, at least as of a couple of 100 years ago, of what images are worthwhile to impart, are worthwhile to bring one step in time forward. Yes.
Okay, so I think, I don't know whether we have more questions, but if we don't actually, so let me ask you something that is just like, oh no, okay, sorry, there is another question by Toman Barsby, so let me give him, I can read it for you.
No, Toman, we do not have it. So what I know is that particularly from the MTurks, so you see, there is a big part with the MTurk application. So what I did not show you today is about basically how tricksters are being portrayed. So tricksters are doing a bunch of weird things in the stories. They basically steal, they cheat, they deceive. And usually a motif can have a trickster getting punished in the end, or a motif can have a trickster getting, being very successful and, live happily ever after. So, and then we show in this paper that now I didn't show you today, is that societies, oral traditions, where basically tricksters are on average much more punishing, getting punished in the end of the day, compared to societies where tricksters go away with their antisocial, deceiving behavior. These societies, the former, the ones where tricksters are punished, they are actually doing much better on average in terms of trust, and they have registered higher economic outcomes today and at the group level if you use a satellite light density. But now one thing that goes to your question is like, we have basically MTurks, how we get, so MTurks read the motif, but you have instances where basically the MTurk themselves, we have 10 of them, 6 of them might say X, and 5 of them might say whatever, 4 of them might say Y. So for now, we're using the modal answer of, what is the mode when they see this motif. But there is very interesting variation into that actually the same motif can be read differently by different people. So this is actually a motif level diversity. I'm not sure whether you're talking about this, but it's like, this is about the ambiguity thing, right? That one motif, on average we understand it this way, but it can be a substantial fraction that understands in a different way. And this is about the ambiguity of the message. We are not doing anything about the ambiguity. We're just doing about them right now. What is the modal answer? And we're leaving the perhaps more interesting variation on the side. Georgie.
Okay, so if there are no questions, let me actually bridge on what you just said, because I was exactly thinking about this further step that you can do in your work, right? So perhaps with Amazon MTurk, what you can do is target the exact population of the country for which you have narratives and try to say something about the persistence. I mean, you have several stuff happening in migration and so on and so forth. But the way in which people answer differently to something that was stuck in the memory of that society might give you some idea of how the values are changing over time, right? So you can also take this ambiguity to somehow track a little bit the evolution of these, let's say, of how the new citizens of these states read the old motive that was actually there in the country.
I see what you say. Well, this is one way to go. Again, this opens the way that right now, who are we using to read the motifs? We're using basically very highly rated American MTurk workers. So we have very highly rated American MTurk workers that read the motifs about the Navajo, read motifs about, the Maasai. Is this the right way to do it? Is this the wrong way to do it? Should we try to recruit Swahili to read Swahili oral tradition, and Greeks to read Greek, and Navajo to read Navajo? Or so is the message culture specific, or is the message universal? By asking this question right now and putting Americans highly rated the MTech workers, we're taking the stand that actually this is a universal message. So then it can be read by different people and reach the same conclusion. It is an assumption. It is not clearly stated anywhere, or we have not seen it clearly stated. Now, one thing that probably, but I have been taking the other way of thinking in what you just suggested. I was thinking that in cultures where basically, so there's this very interesting work by Nan and Julian about the persistence and change of culture. Well, when I really like this paper because it asks a very, very interesting question. Now, if I were to take this in the context of folklore, I would like to think about, if I have cultures that have oral traditions that for the same image and for the trickster, let's say, someone doing something antisocial, if I see that this society actually has an oral tradition that has a diversity of how these tricksters are actually punished. Sometimes they're punished, sometimes they're not, sometimes they get away with it. So this gives me a culture that has a richer set of actions that it can draw from compared to others that always one thing happens. Everybody's punished or everybody gets away with it. So this takes me to the point that basically you could think about, origins as an origin of diverse actions, that you come from societies that admit many different responses, which over time you might think, well, hold on, I'm seeing these guys that are playing X today, but they were playing Y yesterday, so there's no correlation. But no, the action is to play X one generation and Y the next generation. Why? Because it's in the original mindset, it admits a mixed equilibrium, that you flip a coin versus play always X. And then we're tracing the correlation of X over time that makes us think that is persistent. I'm thinking of a slightly deeper thing, that your parents do not always tell you, do this. They tell you, do this, if this, do that, if that. And then the correlation in actions can actually be zero, but the narratives are telling you exactly how to play. So this the culture persists, experiment, but the experiments over time, the outcomes are zero correlation. So what are you saying? That of course the outcomes are zero correlated, so then there is no persistence of culture? No, but the very actions of zero correlation are an outcome of a very persistent, let's say, experimentation concept. Yeah, so, but that's again a side of how to think about evolution, stability, instability. Guys, thank you so much. There's like
thank you, Stelios.
Are deep questions, and that just like scratch the tip of the iceberg.
Thank you. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Stelios. I think we answered all the questions, so we did a good job even for that. So we reconvene next week with the next Lane Up seminar. Thank you again, Stelios, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Stelios. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.